The morning of the 22nd of August 1986 began with an unnatural, suffocating silence. In the lush, remote highlands of northwestern Cameroon, the sun rose over a sprawling network of farming villages nestled in the valleys below Lake Nyos. Typically, this time of day would be alive with a cacophony of sound: the crowing of roosters, the lowing of thousands of cattle, the chatter of farmers preparing for the harvest, and the hum of countless insects. But on this particular morning, there was absolutely nothing. The wind blew through the tall grass, but no living creature responded to it. When a local farmer named Ephraim Che awoke on a high hillside overlooking the village of Lower Nyos, he felt a strange, paralyzing lethargy. His breathing was shallow, his limbs were impossibly heavy, and a foul, metallic taste lingered in the back of his throat. Looking down toward the valley, he expected to see the familiar plumes of smoke from morning cooking fires. Instead, a strange, translucent mist seemed to cling to the valley floor, unmoving and heavy. As he forced himself to walk down the dirt paths toward the center of the village, the unsettling silence gave way to a scene of incomprehensible stillness. The roads were littered with the bodies of cattle. They had not been attacked. There were no wounds, no signs of panic or stampede. They had simply collapsed where they stood. And as Ephraim moved deeper into the settlement, the true scale of the nightmare revealed itself. Scattered across the courtyards, inside the clay brick homes, and lying along the dirt roads were the villagers. Entire families rested exactly where they had been the night before. Some were found in their beds, others huddled around the ashes of extinguished fires. Some had fallen mid-stride near their doorways. There were no signs of a struggle. There was no blood, no structural damage to the buildings, and no indication that any weapon had been fired. It was as if a switch had been flipped, instantly turning off the life of every breathing creature in the valley. In a matter of hours, word would reach the outside world, sparking one of the most baffling and terrifying medical and geological mysteries of the 20th century. Within a 15-mile radius of the lake, an estimated 1,746 people were dead, along with more than 3,500 livestock. Yet, the plants, the trees, and the buildings were entirely untouched. To understand the sheer impossibility of what investigators found, we have to look at the ground beneath these villages. The Oku volcanic field rests on the Fend Cameroon line, a 1,000-mile-long chain of volcanoes and tectonic rifts, stretching from the Gulf of Guinea deep into the African continent. The landscape is dotted with beautiful, deep crater lakes, known as Mars, which formed thousands of years ago when rising magma met groundwater, causing massive steam explosions that left behind deep, steep-sided craters. Over millennia, rain filled these craters, creating tranquil, sapphire-blue bodies of water. Lake Nyos was one of these. To the untrained eye, it was a peaceful, isolated lake, roughly a mile wide and over 600 feet deep, surrounded by high cliffs on 3 sides. It provided water for the surrounding agriculture and served as a quiet backdrop to the villages of Nyos, Kam, Cha, and Subum. But local folklore held a different, darker perspective on the water. For centuries, the indigenous oral traditions of the region contained strict warnings about the crater lakes. Elders spoke of bad spirits that lived in the deep water, capable of rising up to strike down the living. Some tribal myths explicitly warned against building homes too close to the lake's edge, claiming the water could periodically explode or send invisible demons down the Blas valleys. Today, some anthropologists and historians believe these legends were not mere superstitions, but rather the fragmented ancestral memory of catastrophic geological events. They suggest that the people of the highlands had witnessed the lakes turn deadly before, encoding their survival warnings into the language of myth. But in the late summer of 1986, those ancient warnings were about to cross from myth into a terrifying reality. August 21 had been a market day. The village of Nyos was busier than usual, filled with visiting traders and families who had traveled from neighboring valleys. As evening fell, the weather was typical for the wet season, cool, slightly damp, with a light rain falling over the mountains. People retreated to their homes, ate their evening meals, and prepared for sleep. Records suggest that the anomaly began shortly after 9 p.m. Survivors who lived on the higher elevations later recalled hearing a strange, deep rumbling sound echoing off the cliffs. It wasn't the sharp crack of an earthquake, nor was it the booming roar of thunder. Instead, it was described as a low, continuous churning like the sound of a massive, distant waterfall or a jet. Engines spooling up deep underground, and that is when the environment began to shift. A sudden, violent gust of wind swept down from the direction of Lake Nyos. But this wind carried an aggressive, suffocating odor. Survivors later described the smell as a mix of rotten eggs and freshly fired gunpowder. Almost immediately, upon smelling it, people began to lose consciousness. Those who were awake felt a sudden, burning heat in their lungs. Darkness closed in around their vision, and an overwhelming wave of fatigue pulled them to the floor. One survivor, who had been sitting with his family, remembered his children collapsing mid-sentence. When he stood up to help them, his own legs gave out. He remembered falling to the dirt floor, staring at the ceiling, entirely unable to move his muscles or draw a breath, before slipping into a deep, dreamless coma. Down in the lower valleys, the effect was instantaneous and absolute. Whatever invisible force had rolled down from the mountains was heavier than the surrounding air. It hugged the ground, flowing like water through the ravines, pooling in the depressions, and filling the homes of those who were already asleep. It traveled at an estimated 30 miles per hour, silently extinguishing life in a 10-mile radius. By the time the sun rose the next morning, the deadly wave had dissipated, leaving behind the devastating silence that Ephraim Che discovered. When the first military units, medical personnel, and government officials arrived on the scene a day later, they were completely unprepared for the psychological toll of the landscape. Archival photographs from the recovery effort show rows of bodies being loaded into mass graves, while bewildered, soldiers wore rudimentary gas masks, terrified that whatever disease had swept through the valley might still be contagious. But this was not a disease. And what they found next changed the narrative entirely. Medical examiners quickly realized that the victims showed no signs of infection, radiation, or chemical warfare. Instead, their physical symptoms pointed to something far more specific, yet deeply perplexing: acute asphyxiation. The villagers had simply been starved of oxygen. But how could 1,700 people suffocate in the open air of a massive, well-ventilated mountain valley? The answer lay in the water. When investigators finally made their way up the Steep slopes to look at Lake Nyos. The serene sapphire blue water they expected to see was gone. In its place was a heavy, stagnant pool of murky, rust-red sludge. Aerial photographs taken in the days immediately following the disaster reveal a landscape violently altered. The water level of the crater had inexplicably dropped by over a meter. Along the rocky shoreline, the normally pristine vegetation was completely obliterated. Trees had been violently snapped at their prost trunks, flattened in a radial pattern pointing away from the lake, indicating that a massive surge of water, perhaps a wave nearly 80 feet high, had forcefully slammed against the crater walls before washing back into the basin. The physical evidence painted a terrifying picture of a violent physical eruption, yet there was no lingering heat, no lava, and no ash. When international teams of geologists and limnologists, scientists who study inland waters, descended upon the region, they began lowering probes into the dark, rusted waters of the crater. What they found hidden in the depths finally gave them the identity of the invisible killer. The deeper they lowered their instruments, the more saturated the water became with carbon dioxide. A consensus quickly formed regarding the immediate cause of death. Lake Nyos had essentially detonated a massive invisible cloud of CO2. Because carbon dioxide is roughly 1.5 times heavier than breathable air, it didn't float away into the atmosphere. Instead, an estimated 1.2 cubic kilometers of the gas rapidly spilled over the lip of the crater, cascading down the valleys like an avalanche of heavy water, displacing the oxygen and plunging the sleeping villages into a hypoxic void. But finding the murder weapon was only half the puzzle. The far more terrifying question was how the lake had managed to deploy it. The mechanics of the lake itself provided the first layer of understanding. Lake Nyos is situated directly above a deep pocket of magma. Over countless centuries, magma slowly releases carbon dioxide gas, which gradually percolates upward through the bedrock and seeps into the bottom of the lake. Normally, a lake would naturally circulate. Seasonal temperature changes usually cause surface water to cool and sink, forcing bottom water to rise to the surface and harmlessly vent small amounts of trapped gas into the air. This natural churning process is common in bodies of water around the world. But Lake Nyos was different. It is deeply stratified. Because Cameroon sits close to the equator, the year-round warm temperatures meant the surface of the lake never cooled enough to sink. The upper layers acted as an impenetrable, heavy lid, trapping the cold, gas-rich water at the bottom. For decades, perhaps centuries, the carbon dioxide dissolved into the deep water under immense pressure, absorbing into the dark depths, much like carbonation trapped inside a sealed bottle of soda. And that is when the investigation encountered an impenetrable barrier. Geological models confirmed that the lake was indeed holding massive amounts of compressed gas. But a pressurized system doesn't simply erupt without a catalyst. The soda bottle had clearly been opened, but what actually removed the cap? To this day, the exact geological trigger that set off the catastrophe is still entirely unexplained. As scientists combed the region, attempting to piece together the sequence of events of August 21, the physical data began to contradict itself. Several competing theories emerged, each with just enough evidence to be plausible, but accompanied by frustrating inconsistencies. Some researchers pointed to a landslide. The inner cliffs of the Nyos crater are notoriously steep and structurally unstable. Records suggest that heavy rains had plagued the region in the weeks leading up to the disaster. Some geologists argue that a massive block of rock sheared off the crater wall and plunged into the depths. The sheer kinetic force of millions of tons of rock crashing to the crust bottom could have breached the barrier between the water layers, drawing the highly pressurized, gas-rich water toward the surface where the pressure dropped, causing the dissolved CO2 to violently bubble out of solution. Yet, there is no clear consensus on this theory. While sonar mapping of the lake bed did show debris, experts could not definitively prove whether the rockfalls triggered the eruption or if the violence of the eruption itself caused the rocks to fall. Other scientists believe the trigger was meteorological. They argue that an unusually cold rainstorm swept across the lake that specific evening. If the rainfall was cold and heavy enough, it might have rapidly cooled the surface layer of the lake, causing it to become denser and suddenly sink, forcefully displacing the volatile gas trapped at the bottom. And yet, survivors' accounts from the higher elevations described a low, rumbling earthquake preceding the gas release. This led a third faction of investigators to propose a strictly volcanic trigger. They hypothesized that a small, sudden burst of hot gas, or a minor seismic tremor deep within the magma chamber sent a shockwave upward, violently shaking the lake bed and forcing the deep water to rise. What happened next remains unclear, as the tectonic monitors in the region at the time were too sparse and primitive to definitively capture a localized micro-earthquake. The silence of the earth in the days following the event only deepened the mystery. As the scientific community fractured over competing theories, the investigation seemed doomed to stall in academic debate. But as researchers dug deeper into the archival records of the region, they uncovered a chilling detail that cast new, unsettling shadow over the Lake Nyos disaster. Deep in the bureaucratic files of the Cameroonian government, an obscure incident report was brought to light. It detailed a localized tragedy that had occurred precisely 2 years earlier, on the 15th of August 1984. Just 60 miles south of Lake Nyos sits another deep volcanic crater lake, Lake Nyos. On that humid August morning, a group of 37 people were walking along a dirt road that dipped into a low-lying area near the lake's edge. A truck carrying several passengers stalled on the road. When people exited the vehicle to investigate, they inexplicably collapsed. Others rushed in to help them, only to fall unconscious themselves. By the time authorities arrived, all 37 people were dead. At the time, the incident at Lake Nyos was an absolute anomaly, because the death toll was relatively low, and the area exceptionally remote. It garnered almost no international attention. Local authorities, confused by the lack of physical trauma on the victims, officially blamed the deaths on an undetermined terror attack, suggesting an unknown militant group had released a chemical weapon into the valley. The case was quietly closed, but examining the archival photographs of Lake Nyos, taken immediately after the 1984 event, revealed a terrifying visual parallel. The water of the lake had turned a murky rust red. The surrounding vegetation was disturbed. The victims had died of asphyxiation without any signs of a struggle. The realization struck the scientific community with paralyzing force. Lake Nyos wasn't an isolated freak accident. It was part of a terrifying, unrecognized geological pattern, This phenomenon, now termed a limnic eruption, was a real, recurring mechanism of the Earth. And if it had happened twice in just 2 years, the fundamental question completely shifted. It was no longer just about understanding what pulled the trigger. It was about discovering which lake was next in line. The discovery of the Lake Nyos parallel sent a wave of urgency through the global scientific community. The initial shock of the Nyos tragedy rapidly evolved into a frantic diagnostic mission. Investigators fanned out across the Oku volcanic field, taking deep water samples from dozens of other crater lakes scattered along the Cameroon line. The immediate fear was that a cascading chain reaction might be underway. If the tectonic plates shifting deep beneath the African continent were somehow squeezing the magma chambers, they could be steadily pumping lethal amounts of carbon dioxide into countless lakes. To the relief of the researchers, most of the lakes tested were safe. Their waters circulated naturally, preventing any dangerous buildup. But Lake Nyos and Lake Nyos were uniquely primed for disaster, and the data, returning from Nyos specifically, was terrifying. Even after violently expelling 1.2 cubic kilometers of gas, Lake Nyos was not empty. When scientists lowered their probes into the rust-red water just weeks after the 1986 eruption, they discovered that the bottom layers were already rapidly recharging. The carbon dioxide seeping from the magma chamber below was replenishing the lethal reservoir at an alarming rate. It became abundantly clear that without human intervention, it was not a matter of if Lake Nyos would erupt again, but when. The government of Cameroon, alongside international partners, faced an amphibious, unprecedented engineering challenge. They needed to safely defuse a massive, natural bomb without accidentally triggering the very explosion they were trying to prevent. What followed was a tense, decades-long effort to literally degas the lake. In 2001, after years of intense study and logistical planning, a team of French and Cameroonian engineers installed the first degassing pipe into Lake Nyos. The mechanism they utilized was elegantly simple, but fraught with danger. They sank a long, heavy plastic pipe over 600 feet straight down to the lake bed. Using a mechanical pump, they drew a column of the heavily pressurized, gas-rich bottom water up into the pipe. As the water moved toward the surface, the immense pressure that held the CO2 in solution began to drop. The gas rapidly expanded, forming aggressive bubbles that forcefully pushed the water upward. Once the flow was initiated, the pump was turned off. The expanding gas created a self-sustaining geyser, a violent fountain of water, and carbon dioxide shooting more than 150 feet into the air. Over the next decade, 2 more pipes were installed at Nyos, and a similar system was implemented at Lake Nyos. For years, these artificial geysers continuously vented the lethal gas safely into the atmosphere, slowly bleeding the pressure out of the deep waters. By 2019, researchers confidently declared that the gas levels in both lakes had been reduced to safe thresholds. The immediate existential threat to the region had been neutralized. Yet, for the survivors of the 1986 disaster, the scientific resolution offered little comfort. The psychological and cultural aftermath of the event was devastating. In the immediate wake of the eruption, the Cameroonian military forcibly evacuated the surviving population, moving thousands of people into hastily constructed, overcrowded resettlement camps miles away from the fertile valleys they had called home. For decades, The region surrounding Lake Nyos remained a militarized exclusion zone. The abrupt displacement destroyed the social fabric of the communities. Families were permanently fractured. The loss of their ancestral lands, their vast herds of cattle, and their agricultural independence forced a fiercely self-reliant people into a life of dependency and poverty. Furthermore, the lingering mystery of the trigger left a deep, unresolved trauma. While the scientific community eventually coalesced around the mechanics of the limnic eruption, they never definitively answered why it happened on that specific night in August. Because the trigger remains entirely unexplained, many survivors and their descendants harbor deep suspicions about the true nature of the event. Some historians believe that the failure to communicate the complex science to the local population exacerbated these fears. Without a clear, tangible explanation for the sudden onset of the disaster, rumors flourished. Even today, oral histories within the resettlement camps occasionally attribute the event to everything from secret military weapons testing to the catastrophic anger of the ancestral spirits that their legends had warned them about for centuries. In recent years, the Cameroonian government has slowly begun allowing people to return to the periphery of the Nyos Valley, hoping to revitalize the region's agricultural potential. The lake itself has returned to its serene, sapphire blue state. The rusted shores have grown over with dense, vibrant green vegetation. The degassing pipes still stand near the center of the water, a silent, mechanical safeguard against the deep beneath. But the legacy of Lake Nyos extends far beyond the borders of Cameroon. The discovery of the limnic eruption fundamentally changed how geologists view deep volcanic lakes. Today, researchers cast a wary eye toward Lake Kivu, a massive body of water situated on the border between Rwanda and the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Lake Kivu is roughly 2,000 times larger than Lake Nyos. It sits in a highly active volcanic region, and deep water testing has confirmed that it holds vast quantities of both carbon dioxide and highly explosive methane gas, trapped beneath its heavy surface layers. What makes the situation at Kivu exponentially more terrifying is that millions of people live along its shores. Scientists fiercely debate the stability of Lake Kivu. Some models suggest its stratification is robust, capable of holding the gas indefinitely. Other researchers point to the historical record, noting geological evidence that Kivu may have experienced massive limnic eruptions in the distant past, completely wiping out local biodiversity. The tragedy of Lake Nyos serves as a grim historical warning. It demonstrated with devastating clarity that the Earth holds violent, invisible mechanisms that operate entirely outside of human awareness. It showed how an environment can seamlessly transition from a source of life into a weapon of mass suffocation in a matter of minutes. As we continue to monitor the deep, pressurized waters of the world's volcanic zones, the silent catastrophe of 1986 remains a humbling reminder of our vulnerability. The exact trigger that silenced the valleys of Nyos may never be found, buried somewhere beneath centuries of water and rock, but the silence it left behind still echoes, daring us to understand the ground beneath our feet before it decides to shift again.